If they've done it, it's only because they assumed the people wouldn't let them get away with it. I mean, when you come down to it, a true constitution in any country is the one that's here and here in the people, not the written piece of paper. Because the interpretation of the written paper will change depending on what's here and here. That will change, and that's what's happened in the U.S. So it's not so much the Constitution that's acted as a barrier to government activity and where they feel the limits are. It's not the Constitution, the one hanging in the National Archives, that provides the limits. The limits exist here, and those can change over time depending on how the ruling class propagandizes us. The public schools are extremely useful in this regard, right? There are mills for turning out, quote, good citizens. That means good citizens who have their version of the Constitution here and here, the official version, the version the politicians want people to have. So the war power is illustrative of what I've been saying, and I can see I'm going to run short on time. Article 1, Section 8 reserves the Congress the power to declare war. Yet, of course, as we know, presidents have been invading and occupying countries since, what, 1950 or 50, I think, without a formal declaration of war. Even when Congress has authorized a president to commence military operations, such as in Iraq in 2003, it does so in a way that does not resemble the declarations that were approved before U.S. entry in World War I and World War II. And if you go back and read those, I did an article on antiwar.com a few years ago quoting those actual declarations and the presidential messages asking for those declarations. Compare that to the authorization for the use of force in Iraq, and you'll see it is extremely different. And I'm not fans of Wilson or Roosevelt. Obviously, they cooked up those wars to begin with. But at least they felt they had to go to the Congress and say, not let's go to war, but a state of war exists now with Germany, or in the case of Roosevelt, with Japan. And then they deferred to the Congress's constitutional power, saying it's up to you now to recognize this state of war and declare it, and then give me the authorization to use all means to end it. And again, I'm not giving my blessing to those entries, in those wars. I'm just trying to point out that even these two guys, Roosevelt and Wilson, felt obliged to speak in those terms, and that's because at least people had some sense that a president shouldn't just go to war on his own. That's been totally lost. Okay, now this is not to say that all we need to do is bring back the Constitution. You often hear this. But, I don't see first of all, I'm not sure how you do that. I mean, no Constitution can enforce itself. Okay, it's words on parchment. And even Madison called the Constitution a parchment barrier, which means he didn't have a whole lot of confidence that it was going to protect freedom. Again, it gets to what's here and here in people. Law, I mean, we often invoke, and I don't mean to shatter a lot of myths here, but I'll try. We often invoke a distinction between the rule of law and the rule of men. Okay, we say we're a nation of laws, not of men. And it's a famous American kind of saying, again, as in the service of this American exceptionalism. We're different. But the closer you look at that distinction, the more it dissolves. Because laws don't interpret themselves, laws don't enforce themselves. We don't have some robot standing outside of our society that mechanically and perfectly has hardwired in it the meaning of the Constitution or the laws, and then ruthlessly enforces that one correct meaning. I mean, that's not the way human society works. There's no such robot, and parchment can't enforce itself. And it's got to always be interpreted by people. So, what is the distinction between a rule of law and a rule of men? I don't see it because of people have to interpret the laws, and we know how laws in the Constitution have changed in their interpretations over the years, depending on a lot of things. Propaganda by state officials and government schools and events going on in the world, all kinds of things have acted to change this, the interpretation. And any interpretation itself is subject to interpretation. I mean, I don't mean to invoke, I don't think Ludwig Wittgenstein is invoked at many libertarian gatherings, and his politics and his economics weren't too good, but he did make some sense in some other areas, like the nature of language and thought. And if you think about it, any interpretation, if you write a law or constitutional provision, and then at some point you're going to need to, quote, interpret it. But those are words too, so the interpretation is also subject to interpretation. So it gets very complicated. We're not hardwired with the interpretation. People who talk about knowing the original intent and things of that nature, there's a lot less there than meets the eye, because whose original intent? The ratifiers? Madison's? Hamilton and Jefferson looked at the document and saw two different things. And they were living there at the time. I mean, they were living at the time. So it's not so simple. So just to say, well, we got to bring back the congressional power of to declare war isn't going to get us very far. After all, we did get into World War I and World War II with a declaration, right? The Constitution was obeyed, I suppose. Of course, Wilson and Roosevelt had done a whole lot in advance to get the Congress ready to give them whatever they wanted. So, and the person who really nailed this whole point is Randolph Bourne. Now, I think Randolph Bourne was mentioned by Justin Raimondo, and I recommend you read Bourne's two great essays. One is called The War and the Intellectuals. Now, here's a guy who was sort of a progressive, liberal, not in the exactly classical sense. He's kind of a mixed bag. He's for national service. I mean, there's bad stuff in that. A writer for the New Republic. But when all his colleagues became gung-ho about World War I, he said, whoa, this is a mistake. War is a wild elephant. You don't direct war surgically and achieve your, preconceived ends. War is like riding a wild elephant. And he broke with his mentor, John Dewey, and his colleagues couldn't write in the New Republic anymore. He wrote two really good essays. One called War and the Intellectuals, and the other, which he died before finishing, in 1918, was called The State, which I really recommend to you. And he understood that even in a democracy, or democratic republic, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't really matter that the rule is the Congress or the Parliament has to declare war. That's a mere formality. And let me quote him a little bit. He says, the government, with no mandate from the people, without consultation of the people, conducts all the negotiations, the backing and filling, the menaces and explanations, which slowly bring it into collision with some other government, and gently and irresistibly slides the country into war. For the benefit of proud and haughty citizens, it is fortified with a list of intolerable insults which have been hurled toward us by other nations. For the benefit of the liberal and beneficent, it has a convincing set of moral purposes which our going to war will achieve. For the ambitious and aggressive classes, it can whisper of a bigger role in the destiny of the world. The result is that even in those countries where the business of declaring war is theoretically in the hands of representatives of the people, no legislature has ever been known to decline the request of an executive, which has conducted all foreign affairs in utter privacy and irresponsibility, that in order to take the nation into battle. In other words, a Congress is not going to turn down a president, especially since the president has already put everything in place. If you remember back to the 91 war, now he wasn't asking for a declaration in a sense. It was one of those authorizations again. But all the press and all the TV commentators rhapsodized about how this was Congress's greatest moment. They were debating the people's business of war and peace. Yeah, what they didn't mention was were a couple of the following facts. The troops were already in place in the Middle East, and the UN had already issued a deadline to Saddam Hussein to get out of Kuwait. Now, is a Congress going to deny the president under those circumstances anything he asked for? In fact, the argument was, when a few courageous people questioned this in Congress, everyone else stood up and said, are you going to yank the rug out from under the president in front of the whole world? Tell me how many people, I can think of only one today, who would vote against that. It's a paper, it's a sham, it's a paper protection of the people against presidential adventurism. You heard the Hermann Goering quotation that, of course, the people don't want war, but it's the job of the politicians to drag them into war. Mencken also knew this. Mencken wrote, wars are seldom caused by spontaneous hatreds between people. For peoples in general are too ignorant of one another to have grievances, and too indifferent to what goes on beyond their borders to plan conquests. They must be urged to the slaughter by politicians who know how to alarm them. Imagine if some private effort to go to war in Iraq were somehow formulated, and people were going door to door asking for a contribution to fund some private army to go to Iraq. How many people would have put some of their own money into this? I mean, they wouldn't have raised anything.